Okay, hi guys. I'm coming to you outside the library because I was earlier inside and there was a brother doing his assignment, unlike me making this video. But I'm talking to you about worship in Genesis chapter 4 because next week I'm supposed to give this talk about the different forms in worship, and this is to some students in the fellowship. And they also asked me to focus on one of these passages, which is Genesis chapter 4. I was thinking, why Genesis chapter 4? But when I looked at it, it is so interesting, it is so relevant, because it talks about how worship can not just bring us closer to God, worship can even divide us, from one another. Because if you remember, Genesis chapter 4 is about Cain and Abel, it talks about these two brothers. And Genesis chapter 4 is also about the first murder in the Bible. Cain kills his brother Abel. And the reason for that is worship. Worship can cause us to even envy one another, hate one another to the point of, murder. Yeah, isn't that convicting? Well, what do we learn from Genesis chapter 4? I had so many notes today when I was on the train. And I think two things. The first thing is that worship is instinctive. The second is that worship is part of our identity. Yeah, so first thing, worship is instinctive because, who taught these two brothers to worship God? Who taught them to bring their offerings before God? Well, I think no one. This was before the temple, this was before Israel, this is the first book in the Bible, and yet, in the very beginning, we see these two brothers bringing offerings before God, seeking for His approval. It says that God looked at one offering, Abel's offering, with favor, but then He looked at the other offering, Cain's offering, not with favor. And that means what we are doing in terms of these worship is we are approaching God, asking Him to look upon us in love. And I think God has put that inside every one of us. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're even not a Christian, what I'm saying is that God has made us to worship Him. God has made us to look for this kind of ultimate approval. Don't you want people to look at the stuff you're doing today, this video, and say, wow, this is a great job. But ultimately, the approval we're looking for is actually from God. So the first point is that worship is instinctive in all of us because worship is that desire in all of us to want to seek God's approval. That's the first thing. The second thing is that worship is an extension of our identity. Worship is an expression of who we are. And this is maybe comes back to the topic, which is different forms of worship. You get different types of worship because you have different kinds of people. Yeah, you see Cain and Abel, two brothers, but they're very, very different. Cain is a farmer, he works the ground, he produces fruits and vegetables, and so he produces that which he then offers to God. God, have my vegetables. But then he has his brother Abel who looks after sheep and animals, and so he sacrifices animals, he also sacrifices that before God. But you see, they're essentially offering something that reflects who they are. Farmer offers up vegetables, sheep herder offers up sheep, and therefore kind of like the singer will offer up his voice, offer up their singing. Or someone who works might offer up, their money or their work and serve in church, that kind of thing. In other words, these different types of worship might be a reflection of the different kinds of people, different kind of gifts that God has entrusted us in order to give back to Him, to reflect our thanks towards Him. So that's very, very good. But I think what's maybe quite dangerous is that we can then make worship about ourselves. We can make worship about me being accepted before God. Because again, it's a lot of my identity. That altar, when I put the thing on that altar, is actually not just the thing that I made, but I'm putting myself before God. And so when God accepts it, of course I feel really, really great. But when God rejects it, that's when I feel, this is me, I worked so hard for this. When God rejects it, but then accepts the other person's worship, then I go, how can, not fair. And that's where the envy, that's when the hatred, that's when the sin comes about. And so interesting, right? You get these two things about instinctiveness, how we naturally want to worship God. We naturally give God the best of ourselves in our worship, but also worship as our identity, how it can actually be a need for approval and love from God. And when we don't get that, what do we do? What do we do? Do we act like Cain? Do our face fall and the face eyes fall very, very hard? We get very, very sad, causing us not just to be dissatisfied with God, but maybe even envy and hate our brother. Yeah, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Yeah. Genesis chapter 4. But more to go. I have to look at more passages. Thank you so much again, you guys, for sending me this passage. And please pray for me as we prepare for this talk next week on the different kinds of worship in the Bible.